All right. Well, hello and good evening. It is 5 o'clock on Wednesday, October 14th, and I am Sarah Mason, the Division Manager for Recycling with the City of Houston Solid Waste Management Department. I will be the moderator and facilitator of this informational meeting to present the draft of our updated long-range solid waste management plan and to hear comments and questions from you all. This is a virtual meeting using Microsoft Teams, and it is being recorded and will be shared afterward on our project website. I'd like to thank you all for participating in our discussion today and remind you that this is a virtual meeting, and we ask that you please keep your phone or computer muted during the meeting unless or until your name is called on to provide comments. Next. The meeting agenda is on the slide before you. We will have an overview presentation of the long-range solid waste management plan, which will be around 30 minutes and include the background work completed, the goals established, and our recommended future actions. After the presentation concludes, we will take up to 15 minutes to address any written questions that have been submitted in the chat log during the presentation. If you would like to submit a question, you can do so in the chat box. Please type the word question before your entry. We will be monitoring the chat log during the meeting and will address written questions that come in during the presentation afterward, as I mentioned, for up to 15 minutes before we move on to the speaker list. We will begin calling for speakers to share their comments and questions to the group. Speakers will be called on in the order that the requests to speak were received. If you did not sign up in advance to speak, you may do so during the meeting by submitting your name and the phrase request to speak in the chat window of the meeting. If you are on the phone and not in front of a computer, we will call for speakers as well at the end of the presentation. At that time, please briefly unmute yourself and announce your name and that you would like to be added to the list of speakers. Each speaker will have 2 minutes to share their comments or questions, and the project team will respond to those comments at that time. Also, as this is our special student invitation meeting, I would like to ask that if you are a college or high school student joining us this evening, if you would in the chat box let us know what school you're attending from. We'd like to know where everybody is joining in. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to a productive session. We will now begin our overview presentation. Next. So to start out with, why does Houston need a solid waste plan? Why is this an important task? The city is responsible for the management of the waste generated within Houston, either through direct collections as we provide to our residential units or through policy and partnerships with private haulers and community stakeholders for material coming from the commercial sector. As Houston has grown and the available solid waste infrastructure has been used and consumed, we need to focus on how those needs will be met in the future. The goals of the solid waste management plan are to provide long-term solutions for the city's solid waste management needs. We like to follow the hierarchy for integrated waste management, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide that lists the options from the most preferred to least preferred way of handling materials. This plan is a 20-year plan going out until 2040. It discusses how to improve our service and right-size the solid waste management department and how to ensure financial sustainability for our programs and services over the long term. It is also the basis for a zero waste management plan and addresses how to best implement waste priorities of waste reduction, recycling, material recovery, and finally disposal. It identifies what solid waste infrastructure will be needed to meet the city's long-term needs into the future. Solid waste infrastructure includes landfills, recycling, composting facilities, and transfer stations. The plan will have an impact on all sectors of the Houston community, including residential, apartments, businesses, and institutions. Next. I'm sorry, next. The project scope that the city outlined for this task was written to lead to smart solutions, solutions that are action-oriented and where the results can be measured. The city tasked the project team with taking a very detailed look at the status of Houston's solid waste and materials management ecosystem, including existing facilities, their status, and what will be needed in the future. They looked at our current waste generation sources, both at how much, and also where the material is generated, and then use that data to project the amount of waste we can anticipate in the future. They looked at current diversion programs and policies and compared those to adopted best practices in other communities. Finally, they have evaluated Houston's current services and ways of doing business and made recommendations on how we can improve those to protect Houston's environment and the financial viability of the program. The draft plan contains a number of recommendations related to reducing waste, improving service, improving our local environment, meeting future solid waste management needs, and improving the fiscal situation of the department. However, it will not be a final plan until we hear from you and others in the city of Houston and have a chance to incorporate that feedback into the final plan. Next. With all of the research and analysis I mentioned before resulted in several background documents to support the formation of the goals and objectives of the long-range plan. Those background documents, including a facilities analysis and report that looks at the physical solid waste infrastructure, the waste generation forecast and diversion report, which looks at how much trash and recycling we have now and predicts what we will have in the future, the analysis of our current programs and industry best practices, the funding assessment, and finally the draft plan document can all be found on our project website. This project began in September of 2018 with this research and analysis and the formulation of the background documents that informed the draft plan. If you visit our main department website at houstonsolidwaste.org, you'll find a link at the top of the page that will take you to the project website for the long range plan. And there under the documents tab, you can find each of these posted in PDF format for you to download and read. We've broken the plan out into several sections as well, and you can download the full document or the separate sections to read and review. Next slide. Once the background research was completed, we began convening the advisory task force appointed by Mayor Turner to assist the Solid Waste Management Department in completing this project. The task force includes representatives from the solid waste industry, including landfill operators, recyclers, composters, haulers, representatives from the Houston community, nonprofit representatives, and also academia. In total, there were 22 people appointed, and we've held 7 meetings over the last year and a half. At each meeting, the task force was presented information on the different analysis completed by the consulting team and asked to give feedback and guidance on the creation of a sustainable materials management strategy for Houston for the next 20 years. This group has given a lot of their time and their talent for their help on this project. Next. So where are we now in the project timeline? As I mentioned, our approach has been one to identify Houston's needs and resources first, then identify a range of options available to the city, and then from that range of options, develop a Houston-specific strategy for meeting current and future solid waste needs. The project team conducted a series of one-on-one interviews with people in the industry, city staff, and leadership, and then compiled data on all the pieces of our materials management ecosystem. Then, with the help and guidance of the Mayor's Advisory Task Force, goals, objectives, and recommendations were drafted to provide Houston with a sustainable materials management program for the next 20 years. At this time, we are polishing the draft with feedback and comments from our residents. This phase of the project is to gain public input through these public information meetings and requesting written comments on our website. In addition to the information meetings and website, we are also asking for Houston residents to respond to our survey that is posted on the web. The survey is designed to gain your feedback, not just on the plan, but on the performance of our department in providing service and your recommendations for improving those services. So I will hope that you will take a few minutes to check that out after today's meeting if you've not already completed it. The survey will be open until October 31st. It takes about 10 minutes to answer, and as I mentioned before, it can be found on the project website, which you can reach from houstonsolidwaste.org. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Carlton with AZ&B Engineering, who's our project manager on the consulting team, to walk you through the details of their findings and recommendations of the plan.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I first want to express my appreciation to you and your director, Harry Hayes, for letting us be a part of this important project. I also want to thank members of the Mayor's Advisory Task Force for all of their participation and input. I noticed that Dr. Abadi was online, and I want to thank him, not just for participating in that, but also to encourage a number of the students to participate in this. And I welcome them and look forward to hearing your comments, because it's going to be your generation that ultimately solves this problem. Next. Houston's in a unique situation as it relates to solid waste management. The city's solid waste management department provides service to nearly 400,000 households. These services include garbage, recycling, yard waste, tree waste, junk waste collection. Solid waste management department also provides services for collection of materials at drop-off centers and environmental centers where residents can take household hazardous waste. One of the interesting things I learned as part of this planning process is the expansive nature of Houston. It covers 640 square miles, and several large cities could actually fit within its boundaries. Because of that, it has a pretty significant impact on the city's equipment needs as well as personnel needs. Unlike most cities throughout the country, Houston pays for its program through the general fund. This is the city's general fund for general budget for its operations. Most other cities pay for it through an enterprise program, which allows the department to run more like a business. An enterprise fund is a fund where it is set up independent of the general fund, paid for through service fees. During my presentation, we'll discuss issues such as collection needs, facilities such as transfer stations and landfills, and other solid waste management needs. The city's program relies on both public and private sector facilities and is a regional system in many ways. More than 2/3 of the waste comes from businesses and institutions, including multifamily households. Unlike the past plan done for Houston, which just focused on the single family households, this plan looks at all sectors to be involved in addressing future solid waste issues and solutions. Next. Houston's challenges. What are the challenges facing Houston's solid waste management program? Throughout this process, we identified several of them. Funding is the biggest challenge. In comparison to other cities, the amount Houston spends per household is significantly less. Because the funding source is from the general fund, solid waste must compete with other city priorities, such as fire and police, for its funding source. This was a recommendation that we made in the plan that was done in 1990, again, moving towards an independent enterprise fund. Another challenge that the city faces is the increase in multifamily housing also creates unique problems for the city's collection program. New approaches to dealing with these situations will need to be explored and implemented. The commercial sector accounts for a majority of the waste stream. 3.5 million tons comes from businesses, including multifamily households, compared to 700,000 tons generated by the residential sector. If the city is going to achieve its goals of large-scale waste reductions, both the commercial and multifamily sectors also need to be involved in the solution. Storm events such as Hurricane Harvey and other events have increased over the years, and each year the city has to deal with major wind and flooding events. These events create large quantities of waste that need to be managed in a short period of time. Finally, disposal capacity in the region is approximately 30 to 35 years As local landfills reach capacity, the city will have to haul waste longer distances. To assure capacity is available over the long term, the city needs to be planning now because it takes approximately 10 to 15 years to secure new capacity. Currently, the city relies on the private sector for 100% of its disposal. Next. As Sarah mentioned, we did a fairly extensive analysis both on the waste generation and on the facility side. Houston residents, businesses, and institutions generate approximately 4.3 million tons of waste per year. If there are not major changes in the way that products are produced or in the way that we manage the waste stream, this is expected to increase to 5.4 million tons by the year 2040, just because of increases in population and economic activity. Again, residents are responsible for 20% of the waste stream. It's essential that all Houston sectors take a responsibility for reducing waste if the city is to improve its environment and assure long-term disposal capacity. There are encouraging signs, though. We did look at the recycling programs throughout the city, both public and private. We estimated approximately 2 million tons of material are currently being recycled. Much of this is construction and demolition waste, but there are efforts by several businesses in Houston to make significant reductions in waste generation. Several large businesses have sustainability programs that are designed to not only reduce the amount of waste that they're generating, but look at the products that they produce and see how they can be more efficient and make them easier to recycle. We're optimistic that these changes will impact current trends in waste management, but to be on the safe side in terms of looking out for future capacity, we generally look at the worst case scenario so that those facilities will be available when they're needed. Next. Houston solid waste infrastructure. We looked at what are the facilities that are currently being used to manage solid waste. When people think about a waste management facility, they often think of a landfill. In fact, the region relies on a number of facilities for managing waste. These include material recovery facilities, which process the recyclable materials that residents put out in their recycling cart, scrap material dealers, which buy recycled paper, plastics, metals, and other recyclables, drop-off centers and recycling centers where people can bring trash and recyclables. Often the drop-off centers and recycling centers are the only option that residents of apartments or other multifamily households have an opportunity to participate in recycling. There are mulch and composting facilities that process yard waste, brush, tree waste, and in some cases, sludge and food waste. Transfer stations are facilities where collection vehicles take their waste to a facility and transfer the waste to larger vehicles that are much more efficient in hauling waste long distances, especially in areas that have high traffic congestion. And finally, landfills. These are engineered facilities with liners, covers, and regulated operating and closure standards. As part of this planning process, we put together a report that identifies all of these facilities and issues in terms of capacity and throughput. Next. As I mentioned, majority of the waste right now is going to landfills that are located throughout the region. Increases in waste reduction efforts and recycling will mitigate the need for capacity, but in the short to midterm, the city is going to have to continue to rely on landfills for proper waste disposal. There's no silver bullet currently available to completely eliminate landfills at this time. The city relies on every one of the landfills in the Houston-Galveston region for its disposal needs. The landfills have an estimated capacity, again, between 30 and 35 years, assuming waste generation continues on its current path. For new capacity, either the city or a private firm is going to have to identify an acceptable site, secure a permit from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which may include a public hearing, then construct the landfill. Again, this is about a 10 to 15-year process. Next. As I mentioned, we worked with the Mayor's Advisory Task Force, and I do appreciate all their time and assistance in guiding us in providing local input into the plan. We presented them with a lot of information, again, on waste generation facilities, as well as options for dealing with solid waste. But before we went through all of that, we asked for their input in identifying, excuse me, specific goals and objectives for the plan. These goals and objectives basically provided us with guidance on where the community wanted to see the program go. They identified 5 major categories. The project team evaluated data, evaluated the options that are available, and then looked at what other cities are doing to manage waste. From that, we presented a range of options for the task force and had them involved in prioritizing specific recommendations. The following slides go through these 5 categories and identifies some of the key issues and the specific recommendations of the plan. And we recognize in doing this that this is one of those services that's very personal to everyone that lives in Houston. In some ways, this issue touches everybody, because if we all generate waste, and we have to have it managed properly. So we took that into consideration as we developed the recommendations. Next. As I mentioned, there was 5 areas that the task force wanted us to focus on. Sustainable materials management means reducing waste through public education and incentives, as well as for better product stewardship, recycling, and composting. Quality service means quality and timely service to Houston residents, and to engage the commercial sector more in the future years. The infrastructure for materials management means to make sure that the necessary facilities are there for the city's long-term needs, not just for disposal, but for processing materials as well. The program should be financially sustainable. The program should have the fiscal resources to pay for the quality of service that residents expect from the department. The program should also recognize the needs of low-income individuals. The task force was very clear about making sure that we address that as part of this goal. Finally, Beautiful City, which focuses on reducing illegal dumping, cleaning up existing sites, as well as cleanup of homeless encampments and increased litter control. Next. First area that I want to talk about is sustainable materials management. And again, this is to work towards a zero waste community. Next. And here I'd like to introduce Allison Trulock. Allison was part of our team that focused on the recycling and source reduction aspects of the plan, to talk a little bit about some of the issues that cities face right now. Allison?
Sure, Mike. The main things that are facing recycling programs for every city out there are markets and contamination. So when we talk about markets, we mean when you put your recyclables in the recycling container, the city collects it, takes it to their processor, the processor sorts it out and bales it, and then sells those bales to the recycling markets. And recycling markets have always been volatile, but over the last couple of years, really since the beginning of 2018, the recycling market prices have been very low. They've remained pretty depressed. And so that reduces the revenue that can be generated in these cities' recycling program. The other piece of it is contamination, and contamination is really anything that doesn't really belong in your recycling container if it's not actually part of the recycling program. Once that gets to the processor, it has to be sorted out and then hauled from the processor to the landfill. So it actually adds cost and slows down efficiency. So local governments can't really directly impact markets necessarily, but all of us can impact contamination. Mike? You're on mute.
Next slide. One of the things that Sarah mentioned, and we have collected quite a few surveys back already, is we did a community survey related to solid waste management and some of the issues that we're dealing with in the plan, and we'll take into account those comments when we put the final plan together. We looked at some of the recycling issues and asked people questions regarding, their participation and whether they had recycling available or not. What we found was about 86% of the respondents do place recyclables in their carts for collection every 2 weeks. 90% state that they're confident or somewhat confident that they're doing it correctly. Wilson mentioned this is probably one of the biggest issues for this residential recycling program, is that in spite of that number, about 35% of material that's collected during the recycling program is contaminated materials. 67% say that their carts are over 80% full on the collection day. 27% use food waste for backyard composting. In terms of the multifamily and the commercial sector, 68% of apartment residents do not have recycling available, and 60% say that their workplace does not have a recycling program. Next. So in putting together the recommendations for the Sustainable Materials Management Program, again, it's a path towards zero waste. We did put a comprehensive plan together that deals with all of these sectors. Some of the recommendations include adopting the climate action plan that the city has formally adopted. It has a recommendation for residential reductions of 50% of the material by 2040, to enhance public information, public education programs, enact measures to significantly reduce contamination in residential recycling, enhance multifamily recycling efforts, initially through public information, public education programs, getting more people to use the recycling centers and the depositories, and then ultimately looking at mandatory programs for apartment owners to provide that service. Next. Other recommendations included enhancing the private sector source reduction and recycling efforts. Again, they have to be part of the solution if the city is going to achieve its goals. Initially through public education, collaboration, and then ultimately towards mandatory programs to get the reductions that are needed. Encourage greater food waste management through reductions, food donations, and composting. Divert sludge to composting facilities. And finally, improving data gathering and program evaluation tools for the solid waste management department. This will allow them to better monitor what's going on in the city, define or determine which programs are working best and what programs need improvement. Next. Second area that we looked at was providing quality of service. This means improving the service that's being provided, as well as the efficiency in which the department's able to operate. Next. It's pretty incredible what the solid waste management department is able to provide given the budget and fiscal resources they've got available to them. They provide garbage and recycling services to residents, monthly bulk waste collection, weekly yard waste collection, comprehensive environmental programming, including drop-off sites and household hazardous waste collection, the reuse warehouse and neighborhood depository sites, great disposal and recycling processing contract with FCC, which is the firm that processes the recyclable materials, highly successful disaster debris management program. Again, it provides all these services on basically a shoestring budget. The department's involved in a number of efforts, again, to improve recycling, and other programs. Next. As mentioned, the city is operating on a pretty tight budget, and because of that, it has had some bumps in service. And in our survey responses, we see that a little bit in terms of some people experiencing very positive service, good service from the city, and others that have certain issues with the way it's being provided. The other thing that we asked in the survey was, how full are their carts during collection? And a majority of residents said that their carts are either 60% full or more. And what we're trying to accomplish through the plan is to flip that a little bit and make sure that the majority of residents have their cart significantly less full every week during collection. Next. So the recommendations that we've developed for the plan as it relates to quality service include right-sizing the operation by expanding fleet and staffing to meet the citizen commitments, and to establish route allocations that get the work done in an 8 to 10 hour day basis. Right now they're experiencing a lot of overtime hours simply because they don't have the necessary staff and equipment to meet those needs. Secondly, to modernize the waste fleet. It's not just enough to have all the equipment that you need, but it needs to be modern, less than 7 years for their collection vehicles, so that they operate efficiently and are available whenever they're needed. Expand the number of drop-off facilities and household hazardous waste collection services, and provide efficient, safe, and responsive services during times of heavy storms or other disaster events. Next. Infrastructure for materials management. The goal here is to ensure that there's long-term capacity available and that there is a sustainable solid waste infrastructure, especially to meet the anticipated increases in recycling, either whether it's materials recycling or composting. In 2019, the city took a big step in meeting this goal with the construction of the FCC Material Recovery Facility. This facility is owned by the city and processes recyclable materials from not just households, but businesses as well. It's been recognized as nationally as one of the best facilities in the country. In the coming years, the city will need to improve its existing transfer stations, add more drop-off centers, and evaluate ways to make sure that there's a place to dispose of waste. Next slide, please. The future solid waste infrastructure needs. Currently, Houston region, that includes the Houston-Galveston area, has 12 municipal solid waste and 15 construction and demolition landfills. Capacity is decreasing annually at these facilities. We've also talked about an aggressive waste reduction and recycling program. However, even with big changes in waste management practices, the city will continue to need to rely on landfills for disposal for the foreseeable future. Houston's transfer stations, and they have 3 of them. They own them and they're privately operated. They're 20 years and older, in need of repair. In addition to these transfer stations, the city will need to incorporate transfer capabilities for recyclable materials collected across city and transported to the FCC facility. We do want to point out that the FCC, as I mentioned, the FCC was recognized nationally. One of the things that we looked at in the plan, and a study was done a couple of years ago looking at the 3 transfer stations, because of their age, needing about $12 million in improvements. This was a couple of years ago. Because of the budgetary situation, those improvements still need to be made. And then we'll also be needing additional transfer capability in the future. Next. One of the questions that we asked in the survey was, should the city be proactively involved in planning for the future disposal needs of the city? Again, all of the landfills right now are privately owned, and over 76% said that the city does need to be involved in this and be proactive in planning for this this future need. Next. So some of the recommendations that we had in terms of infrastructure management include constructing a new transfer station in the northeast part of Houston, investing in existing transfer station. As I mentioned, there's improvements that are long overdue that need to be made. Site and permit a new city-owned landfill, and this may be either operated by the city or operated privately. Evaluate closed facilities for brownfield development. This is used closed landfill sites for new development. One of the examples is the city has got a project where they'll be creating a solar farm on a previous site where a landfill used to be. And then evaluate rail haul as a long-term option for the city to transport waste, depending on where its ultimate disposal site needs to be. This is an increasing trend for large-scale communities that can't place landfills close to urban centers because they have to be transported long distance. Rail haul is sometimes the most efficient way to do that. And finally, to track and evaluate resource recovery technologies for meeting the city's future needs. Exploring those options such as chemical recycling and working to implement those projects when they are technically, economically, and environmentally feasible. Next. The fourth area that we looked at was assuring financial sustainability. Houston needs a more sustainable funding mechanism to be competitive with other cities and to provide quality services to residents while expanding efforts towards sustainable materials management. I've mentioned this before, the city's program is extremely underfunded and relies on the general fund for its budget needs. Most cities get their funding through either a monthly service fee, which is charged to residents that receive services, or an environmental fee, monthly environmental fee. And the environmental fee applies to not just residents, but also to businesses and apartment owners. Funds from an environmental fee go to projects that benefit the entire city, such as cleaning up illegal dump sites and providing more depositories throughout the city. And again, want to emphasize that when we looked at this, we wanted to make sure that this was an equitable program to all residents, including low-income households. Next, please. We looked at other cities in terms of how their situation was budget-wise and employee comparison to what Houston situation is. And you can see, I've got a table here that compares Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Austin. Houston provides service to 390,000 households, which is more than any of those other four cities. And in terms of the households that they serve per employee, they provide service to 893 households per staff member in that department. When you look at the other cities, they range from 434 to 570, which means on average, Houston's employees are providing service to twice as many households. And when you look at the budget, Houston's budget of $92 million to provide all the services that we've described, budget per household is $235. And again, in comparison to other cities, that ranges from $308 to $494 per household. Again, that illustrates that city's budget is almost half of what these other communities have to manage solid waste for households and to implement programs such as recycling effectively. Next. We did a comparison also. We looked at both cities in Texas as well as cities across the country. This table that we have here illustrates solid waste fees that are currently being charged in other cities, whether it's a user fee or an environmental fee. These fees range from $15 to $50 per household per month. And it's dependent on the level of service, recycling and reduction efforts. While Austin has the highest rates, they also have the highest degree of material recovery and source reduction results. Next. So if the city's program were to be sustainable, financially sustainable, what would that ultimately provide? In the near term, we would see that it would right-size the city's collection with the necessary collection equipment and staffing, increase the number of additional depositories needed. The city currently has 6. They need 5 more to meet demand and coverage for the city's vast footprint. Increase the number of inspectors needed to address illegal dumping enforcement in a more substantial way. With proper resources, customer service levels would be greatly enhanced. And finally, provide a quality or first-class programs designed to reduce waste and increase the amount of materials that are being recycled. Next. We did ask residents, whether or not they would support a fee, and it is somewhat of a mixed result at this point. We're still collecting results. But what it shows is we asked the question, would you support a fee for the expansion and improvement of service? Right now it shows 43% would agree or strongly agree with that. 18% are neutral, and approximately 39% would be opposed to it. We asked the question, would you approve of a fee if it ensured that the system properly sized and allows for growth? And again, we had somewhat similar results there in terms of approval, those people that are neutral to that response versus people that oppose the fee. Next. So the recommendations that we have as it relates to financial sustainability include establish funding mechanisms that provide long-term financial sustainability for solid waste management needs. These funding mechanisms would include a monthly service fee and an environmental fee for all sectors, and then also looking for grants and partnerships to assist in funding programs. The Solid Waste Management Department has been very successful in securing some grants through the Houston-Galveston Council of Governments. Provide services utilizing best management practices, evaluate opportunities to provide financial assistance for low-income homeowners, similar to the water program that the city currently has. And this is a program that assists residents pay for their water bill. And then evaluate opportunities for public-private partnerships to operate efficiently. Next. The last area that we looked at was Clean and Beautiful City. One of the key priorities from the Mayor's Advisory Task Force was to address illegal dumping. The city definitely needs more resources and better enforcement to deal with this issue. Next. Some of the major issues that we identified through this process were the fact that there is an increasing number of illegal dump sites. The figure that's on this slide illustrates the council districts, but the dots that are on that map represent identified illegal dump sites, I believe over about a 12-month period. There are insufficient number of drop-off sites to cover Houston's vast geographic area. Disposal costs are increasing, and lack of funding for both enforcement and cleanup of sites. Next. Again, going back to the survey, 93% of the respondents felt it was important for the city to have an active anti-litter program as well as cleaning up illegal dump sites. We also asked respondents whether they've used one of the city's drop-off facilities, and that shows approximately 70% have. Next. The recommendations that in the plan that deal with a clean and beautiful city include reduce litter throughout the city, presenting a more beautiful and healthier Houston, enhance efforts to reduce illegal dumping throughout the city, increase the number of drop-off centers and expand hours of operation, more aggressive enforcement of illegal dumping laws, improve communication among enforcement officials, and continue to clean up homeless encampments. Next. So those were the 5 major goals that the task force wanted us to address in the plan. Moving forward, what has to happen is we will take comments. This public meeting is one of those opportunities. If the plan is adopted, what would happen? And in the near term, what we would see is a financial sustainability improved for the program, right-sizing service operations. The city would be able to establish best practices for fleet replacement, enhance customer engagement and education, initiate future waste disposal outlets now, strengthen transfer station infrastructure through the construction of a new facility, looking at the recycling material transfer capabilities and improving the existing sites, multifamily and commercial waste management reductions. All of that's going to require city council to evaluate each one of these options and implement them through either changes in ordinances or funding the program. Next. So our next steps are, we presented the draft plan to the Mayor's Advisory Task Force and gotten their comments on our initial draft. We're looking for comments through these public meetings, through the survey. We'll evaluate those and make changes to the plan as necessary. And then we'll go back to the task force, present them with any changes that we've made. Once they've approved it, present it to council. Then it's up to the council to fund and implement projects. Next. And again, we're interested in your comments on the plan. And there are a couple of opportunities to do that. The city's solid waste website is identified here. It's houstonsolidwaste.org, or provide written comments to longrange@houstontx.gov. And with this, Sarah, I'd like to turn it back to you and take questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Mike, for that great presentation. As Mike mentioned, at this time, we are going to address any questions and answers that you may have that you want to type into the chat box. So if during the presentation you have questions about anything that was covered, please do submit your questions in the chat log and we will address those now. Also, a reminder, if you want to share your comments out loud and speak to the group, please put your first and last name in the chat log with the phrase request to speak, and we will add you to the list for speakers. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us. A reminder, we are recording the meeting, and it will be available for review on our website, on the project website after this evening. Also, the slides from this presentation are available on that website, along with all of the background documents and the draft plan document. So we will, I'm going to check now and see if we've had any questions come in the chat log, or and then if we do, we'll take 15 minutes to address those before we'll start calling for speakers, or up to 15 minutes, I will say. Again, this was a student invitation. Everyone is welcome, but we did target this as a student invitation with high school and college students. And I think we've got a lot of students on the line, it looks like. Most of you are from TSU, so thanks for joining us this evening. And, you know, please let me know what your questions are.
Excuse me, do you hear me?
Oh, yes.
I don't see the log, the chat on my end. I can't type in anything.
Oh, okay. In your Microsoft Teams, if you in the window, in the meeting window, there's a little row of icons. One looks kind of like a text box with lines drawn
I
into
have my
it.
sister next to me, and she's able. She have a chat, but I don't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's weird. I only see the people in the meeting, but I don't have a chat.
That's interesting. I'm not
I don't
sure
know
if
if
that.
I can close the meeting and try to log in again. Maybe it will work. I'm not
Sure, you can try that. Yes, or if you said you're next to someone who has access to it, you can. Maybe that person can let you type in your question.
Okay, I just want you to get my name. My name is Aya Ahmed, because I'm not able to type it.
Okay.
And I'm
precinct, so let's call it halftime.
Okay, thank you, Aya. We'll make sure we've got you down. I hope no one else is having that issue with the chat log to type in their questions or requests to speak. Okay, I'm not seeing. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions here at this time. I know that we did have a couple of speakers who
was real, because a lot of people lost their lives from that. Going forward, we're going to be more diligent on the calibration of the virus.
Okay, I'm hearing some background noise. Okay, I know that we did have a couple of speakers who signed up in advance. I'm not sure if they are on the line. Okay, well, do we have any questions? I don't see any questions, so I will call. Is Bettina Patterson on the phone or in the meeting? I did receive an email with a request to speak at today's meeting. Bettina Patterson. Okay, let me see the other person that I had. Is there a James Wilcoxon on the phone or in the meeting? James Wilcoxon. Okay. All All right, those are my two speakers I had in advance. We have had a question come in. What is something that can be done to incentivize more profitable future for recycle centers? That's a very good question. And a lot of it depends on the commodities market, which is a dynamic market and changes with supply and demand in the global economy. I will, I think, call on Allison Trulock. Oh, I should mention, I apologize, I forgot to introduce our project team that we have on the call as we move into the question session to let you know who you may be hearing from. You heard the overview presentation from Mike Carlton. Again, he's with AZ&B Engineering in Dallas, and he's been our project lead for this. We also have Allison Trulock with NewGen Strategies on the call. Her background and expertise is in waste reduction, recycling, reuse, and so she really did a lot of the work in helping us fill out the recommendations for the Sustainable Materials Management section. We also have Risa Weinberger with Risa Weinberger and Associates on the phone. She's got several decades of experience in organics and composting, both at a commercial scale, looking at biosolids and also food composting. And so she's got that background. And we also have Tammy Wallace with InFocus Strategies on the phone, and she's been helping us with our public outreach and communications part of the plan. So I did mean to introduce them before I started calling on them to answer questions, so you would know the people who were talking to you as they answered those questions. If you were on the call, on the meeting before we got started, you saw their bios and information on our introductory slides. So back to the question at hand, I will call on Allison maybe to help us out with this. Question again is, what is something that can be done to incentivize a more profitable future for recycle centers?
Okay, sure. And Sarah, I think where you were starting to go with it on, the commodities market and kind of talking again about those recycling markets that have been very low in recent years. Part of the reason for that, and Sarah was alluding to this with how it is kind of a global market, and China had historically been one of the largest purchasers of recyclable materials from the US. And beginning in January of 2018, they banned certain materials altogether from being imported into China and put some very stringent contamination restrictions on other materials. So I think part of getting to a more profitable future for recycling is, and there are efforts underway here in the US to have domestic reclamation, meaning there would be processing facilities here that would go beyond the materials recovery facility that just bales the material. We would have processors and end users here in the US that would turn those materials back into new products, again, to actually recycle the products. So part of the answer is to increase the demand again for the recyclable materials. There are other countries that have kind of stepped in to buy more of the recyclables that are collected here in the US. The reality of today is that domestically in the US, we just don't have enough demand, but there are facilities that are either expanding, like paper mills. There are several paper mills that are expanding to be able to accept more recyclable material here in the US. There's also some movement on plastics processors here in the US to be able to take more of those recyclables. So I think it will take a little bit of time, but I think the good news is that as we can improve the demand for those materials and not rely as heavily on one particular importer for our materials, the economics will start to look better over time.
Yeah, thank you. And I will mention that there's a couple of things maybe of interest. The Texas State Legislature passed Senate Bill 649 during their last legislative session, which was in 2019. The state legislature meets every other year. And that bill called for a recycling market development study to be completed for the state of Texas. This built upon some previous studies done on sort of the rate of recycling within the state across all materials, and also looking at the economic impact of recycling as an industry for the state. So the next step was to look at those opportunities, as Allison mentioned, to help develop out the end market for recycling. Recycling is a lot of different things. It's everything from putting your soda can or your water bottle or your cardboard box in the recycling container to when the truck collects it, to when it goes to a processing facility and is sorted out into different commodities. And then ultimately when that is sold to a to make something new. And that's sort of closing the last part of the loop, and you need that demand for that feedstock, which really helps drive the market forward. And so I mentioned there's this state recycling market development study that's happening. Also, last week, the EPA released a strategy for recycling for the country, and they're accepting comments until December 4th if you're interested in checking that out. And, so one of the things that they're focusing on there, besides building out infrastructure and reducing contamination, was also this market development piece. So the shift in Chinese national policy and the policies of some other countries that previously imported large amounts of scrap material have shifted over the past couple of years. And so we're seeing a great response within the US to help build out more of that domestic capacity. And that's happening at a lot of levels. So, that's an interesting thing that's happening, that, if recycling is something that you're into and you want to understand it at that bigger level, those are some things that are going on that you may find useful or interesting to look at. So let's see if I have any other questions here. It looks like maybe I received. Okay. So yeah, are there any other questions? I see there's another question that's come in here in the chat log. Let me read this out. So this person has shared, I applaud the effort to get the word out about how to reduce contamination and recycling. I wrote an article in my HOA newsletter about things to do, like not bag aluminum cans, paper, etc. Thank you very much. And exclude styrofoam, but still see major continuation of bad policies in my neighbors recycling trash. How can we all work to get the word out about reducing contamination? That's a great question, and I want to thank you very much for sharing that information with your neighbors and helping them to recycle right with their cart. And I will say that the department is working on a couple of programs. Mike had mentioned we were fortunate to receive some grant funding, so we're working on a couple of things to improve our education efforts around recycling. And typically what I try to remind folks is to remember to recycle their clean, dry, and empty recycling, and to remember to put all their bottles, cans, paper, and cardboard in their recycling cart. So your water bottles, your soda cans, glass bottles, and jars are accepted in the city's program. And we're typically talking about things from packaging, from products from your kitchen, bath, and laundry. And if we could get all of our Houston residents to put all those materials in their cart, loose, not bagged, we would be able to see big improvement in our program. Contamination is, so when programs started moving away from dual stream collection, which if you've lived in Houston in some time, you may remember our curbside recycling program used to be collected. You would put your materials in like a small 18-gallon bin that you would take to your curb, and you would keep your paper separate and your bottles and cans separate. And that was a manual collection. So we could have really low contamination rates because our crews who were picking that up, if they didn't put it in the truck, then it didn't get mixed in the stream. But we didn't, because the container is small and because it's a little bit less convenient than having a large covered cart, our participation in our volume was not that great. And that's sort of typical of those types of collection programs. And as you started moving to single stream, the advantages are you get a lot more collection and you get a lot more material. The disadvantage is you do typically see a little bit more contamination. So that's something we are working to improve. And I think I'll call on Allison again to see if she has anything to add. I get really interested in talking about recycling, so I may have missed something, and everything
Yeah, I
on
think that
state.
was a really great overview on the contamination side of things, because that is where every individual can have an impact. And this actually relates back to the previous question about making recycling more profitable. That the markets are one side of it, and then the contamination is the other side of it. So just having that contamination in there is making these programs cost more. So if we can get the word out to change the behaviors of those who are participating. So I just wanted to mention a couple of the things that I think Sarah has mentioned it, that are recommended in the plan that has to do with that education and outreach. Part of it is, getting to the how to recycle right, how to get the right stuff in those containers at home or at work, no matter where you're participating in a recycling program. But another part of it too is to just reduce how much waste is being generated in the first place. So we do have some recommendations in the plan that focuses a lot on public outreach and education to help people understand how to recycle right, but also opportunity to not generate that material in the first place.
Sarah, about the only thing that I would add to that from both what you and Allison have covered is that because it is such a huge problem and because it costs the city so much to deal with it, enforcement is one of the things that we've got in the plan as it relates to reducing that contamination, primarily focusing on public education and information, but in the long term, that may be an option available to the city.
Yep, and that would actually mean cart inspections. So actually looking at what people are, just periodically checking on what people are actually putting in the cart, so that it's a more direct way to, leave a notice that here are items that shouldn't be in your cart that we found in there. And conversely, in the trash cart, I see one of the comments that's come up about the correlation between contaminated recycling and full trash containers. That's a good point. Part of it is we don't want to see recyclables in the trash, but we also don't want to see trash in the recyclables. So as Mike was saying, some of the enforcement measures that are described for a potential future action would be going as far as those cart audits for both the garbage carts and the recycling carts.
Could I tag on to what Allison just said? And
yes.
And that's that one of the approaches for trying to keep the solid waste from ending up in the recycling cart is to right size the collection fleet so that the collection is more timely and possibly more efficient, and there won't be as much incentive for people to put their trash in their recycling cart.
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Risa. I was going to add as well that there have, many cities across the country have done some of that cart level either feedback or enforcement, whether it's, I think the city of Seattle may actually issue citations for improper use of carts. Some other cities just leave a cart tag, letting the resident know what they, how they can improve what they've done. But in either case, those programs do tend to lead to improvement in the quantity and quality of the recycling collected, but it does require a dedicated staff resource to be able to go out and do that. You need, a crew of inspectors or taggers that can go out and monitor those things. And at this time, in our department, our budget doesn't allow for us to do those things. So we do appreciate the efforts of neighborhood volunteers and community leaders and volunteers who help us spread the word and share the information on how to recycle appropriately so that we can cover as many people as possible. And while we do have a lot of room for improvement, I will also, Houston, up until it was February 2015, which is 5 years ago, when we finally had citywide curbside recycling with everybody having a single stream cart. So in some ways, we've had residents that haven't had a recycling cart for very long and are still learning exactly the right way to do it. So we are trying to be understanding of that, but it benefits the city and our program for people to you know, when in doubt, throw it out. If you're not certain that it goes in your recycling cart, don't put it in there, because that probably will hurt the program rather than help. So, and we covered that, and there was in great detail, which was really good. Are there any other questions, or would anyone like to share comments out loud? Let us know in the chat box. I also did receive some information for the participant who is having difficulty finding the chat box. I think if you haven't already and you do try logging out of Teams and logging back in, that may solve the problem for you. Someone did do some internet research for you, and that is a possible solution. So yes, thanks for that. I'll ask, I saw that we do have a lot of students on the line. I'm glad that you're here. Are there any questions that you have in general about waste management, recycling, landfill disposal? We are here to talk about the city's long-range plan, which does encompass and touch on all of those things. If you don't have a question about the plan specifically, but have a general question about one of those topics, we do have a great team of experts with many, many years of experience and knowledge. So if you're interested in, this would be a great time to do it. And we're happy to take those and answer them as well. I'll ask Mike this question in general, because I know that you've worked with other cities on similar plans and planning for their needs. Is Houston, you know, we have 30 years maybe left in our existing disposal, where you're takes 10 to 15 years to site, permit, open new disposal. So we have a little advantage there. Are we ahead of the game, behind the game? Where do we fall?
In terms of just dealing with the disposal capacity issue, now is a good time to be starting to deal with it, because it is very difficult to identify a site. And we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 1,200 acres of land, depending on how it's situated, for a future landfill to meet long-term needs. It's a process that definitely, with the rise of social media, has become a much more complex task, because nobody wants a landfill in their backyard, but it has to go someplace. And so having the 30 years of capacity, and that's region-wide, for some of the landfills that are close to Houston, that capacity is much less. So we anticipate that they'll run out of capacity, and the city's waste will have to go to landfills farther away. So that'll be the first step that'll happen. One is you got implementation capabilities to deal with the fact that these landfills close to you are going to run out of capacity. But then finding capacity out, you know, to deal with Houston's waste, again, it's about a 10 to 15 year process. Region-wide, you've got about 30 years. So I feel like that now is a good time to be starting this process. The other reason to start now is the way that the region is developing. That means that as future developments start, that's another area where you would not want to put a landfill. If you can find land that's available now that hasn't been developed, you can put that facility there without having a big impact on your neighbors. So that's a reason to start now, is that you have better opportunity not to impact existing landowners before those areas become developed. So it is a fairly controversial process, but one that's necessary. As I mentioned, there is no silver bullet for dealing with solid waste in terms of getting rid of landfills. There are facilities on the East Coast, primarily, some in Florida and some other parts of the country. There's only about 78 of them, which are waste energy facilities. Those are extremely capital intensive, cost probably 4 times more than putting it in a landfill. And there are some environmental issues associated with those options that make it more difficult to implement. So right now, in terms of near-term, mid-term solutions, landfills are it. There's still a strong incentive to do as much material recovery as you can in order to extend the current capacity, but it also, by doing that, extends the capacity of a future facility that you might build.
Yeah, you get those programs in place now, and that helps preserve what you have in the future. We did have a question pop in, when will the landfills be at capacity? I know we've talked 20, 30 years. So if it's 2020, we're looking at really within the time frame of this plan, which goes to 2040, the city needs to be considering future action.
And like I said, the difficulty in siting facilities is also tied with having land available that's not developed right now. And so it's a lot easier to do that before that expansion takes place in some of the areas that you might be looking at in the future. We're working with Dallas Area Rapid Transit, and they had a route that went through downtown that they explored 20 years ago. And because of development that took place downtown, all those acceptable routes or the acceptable routes are no longer acceptable because somebody put a tall building, where that route would be. So that's the
since we're talking about disposal and the impact and thinking through this also, for those not in the industry, they may not know, but Texas and Houston in general have benefited from relatively low waste disposal costs compared to some of our neighbors in, say, the Northwest or the Northeast, the other coast of the country, where space is a little bit more restricted or the closest landfill is further away. And so as our disposal capacity becomes more limited and or the distance that is needed to travel for disposal, then you expect that cost to go up.
Correct. And as mentioned, some of those cities in the Northeast and Florida that rely on some of these other types of facilities are paying $100 a ton to dispose of waste, $110. Whereas in this market, it's closer to a $25 to $30 per ton amount. And to put that in perspective, a single family house may generate 1 ton per year. But, it is an issue in terms of as those landfills reach capacity. The other big problem that the city will face is that it's going to be more difficult for contractors to take their waste to a permitted landfill, which is going to probably increase the amount of illegal dumping unless there's facilities such as transfer stations where they can take that waste that's reasonably close.
Yeah, and it looks like our discussion has generated another question here. Ricky says, I understand we will reach capacity in our current landfills. Do we already have our next couple of landfills / areas selected that have to or are undergoing the 10 to 15 year process of securing a landfill? And the short answer is no. That's why that's a big piece of this planning project. Mike, I'll let you expand on that.
Correct. And I think there are 2 landfills that are seeking some expansions, but they're really not going to add significantly to the capacity of the region. In often cases, a landfill owner can expand their landfill either by adding land or going higher. But for a majority of the landfills in this region, that's going to be very difficult to accomplish, especially for the ones that the city has relied upon. They've expanded over the last 30 some years in different ways, and I think they've reached that point where they can't expand anymore. So no, the next facility has not been identified yet, and that's one of the key recommendations in the plan, is that the city needs to take a leadership role in identifying that site. We had some members from the disposal industry, landfill industry, as part of our task force, and the question came up, do you think it's easier for the privates or the publics under today's environment? I'm talking about, the social, political environment, easier for public or private to identify and permit a new facility? And his answer was clearly it's easier for the public sector these days than it is for the privates to get to that point. Again, it may not be a situation where the city operates that site, similar to the way that you're managing the transfer stations, but it is important for Houston to make sure that capacity is available, and the privates are in the business of running those sites, but they don't have the responsibility to the citizens necessarily that the city does.
It's pretty common actually for landfills to be publicly owned. In the Houston area, it's a little bit unique that the city doesn't own any of the disposal facilities at this time. I know in other cities, either the city operates it or sometimes they lease out the operation to a private company.
Right, it's a pretty big mix across the state. San Antonio, Austin are in a similar situation that Houston is. The city of Dallas and several cities around this area own and operate their own facilities. In Arlington and Fort Worth, what they do is that they own the facility, but they'll contract out the operations of those sites, which gives them a little bit more control in terms of making sure that they've got capacity available over the long term.
Right. We've had a couple other questions come in here related to this discussion. James asks, corporate brands have a huge impact on the capacity of landfills. Might the city support providing a tax break for those companies that keep a large amount of their waste from going to the landfills? That's an interesting question. I'm not in the business of our tax and economic development, but I know that benefits are given to corporations for different activities they take. Mike, do you have any thoughts on that? Or are there any cities that you know of that give incentives for
There are some
diversion?
cities that provide some incentives more for the commercial sector to reduce the amount of waste. A lot of work has primarily been done where local governments act as kind of a coordinating body with the private sector and the both the generators and the markets for those materials. And that's one of the things that we talk about in the plan in terms of having the city have a role with the commercial sector a lot more than what they've got right now. The city does have a commercial program, but given the fact that that's where most of the waste is being generated, wanting to get the city more involved in coordinating efforts between the generators and the markets for those materials. And
right.
Some of those discussions have already started.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's part of the reason that in this updated solid waste plan, the city expanded the scope, as Mike mentioned, to include all of the different sectors, even if it's not material that the city is touching directly collection. All of the stakeholders in the solid waste ecosystem within Houston are utilizing that same infrastructure. And so it is important that we work together to think about how to expand it, how to, or not expand, but the next place that we'll have available disposal and how to preserve what we have, as well as just how to make the best use of the embodied energy that's in the resources, that goes into making these items that end up in the trash stream. If they can be recovered and recycled, reused in some way, then that's has a long-term environmental benefit over landfilling those items.
And I'd just like to briefly add on top of that is that a lot of it's information that needs to get out to the private sector, because even in the midterm, short term, if they can look at their waste stream and find ways to reduce that, either through source reduction or recycling efforts, that's going to have an impact on their bottom line. And as disposal costs go up, the less waste that they're generating, the less they're going to have to pay for taking care of that expense.
Yeah, you start to get a built-in market incentive when that cost for disposal goes up pretty significantly from where it is now. You're right. We have another question from Victor, who says he lives in the city of Houston, but it doesn't look like his neighborhood offers a recycling program. So he wants to know what recycling programs are there available in Houston. So yeah, if you're not living in an area that has city solid waste services, all the residential units that get city solid waste services include single stream recycling that's picked up every other week. However, if the city is not your service provider, you may not have curbside collection, but you can use one of our drop-off facilities. So we have 9 different facilities that take like traditional recycling, bottles, cans, paper, cardboard, and you can find those listed on our website. If you go to houstonsolidwaste.org in the recycling tab, you'll see a drop-down information of all the different recycling drop-offs we have, where they're located, what they accept, and when they're open. So we also have collection for household hazardous waste, which is things like insecticides, herbicides, paints, batteries, things that are hazardous in nature but generated in small quantities from households. And we collect that material at our Environmental Service Center. We have a permanent facility in the south and a once-a-month operation in the north. And then we also have our reuse warehouse, where we accept gently used building materials from anybody, and then we make those available to nonprofit organizations at no cost for reuse. So we do have several different drop-off programs in place, and any city resident is welcome to use those facilities. So I would encourage you to look up that information as well. And then if you haven't already, take the survey we have online related to this project. One of the questions in there asks about different ways that you currently are reducing, reusing, and recycling, and you may be doing things that you're not even aware help reduce your waste generation and disposal. Things like donating things to charity or repairing things when they're broken instead of replacing them, buying in bulk, buying things with recycled content. There's a lot of different ways that you can have an impact on the waste that you're generating and the recycling that you're doing. So we also do electronics recycling, and at our neighborhood depositories, which we have 6 of, which are for heavy trash items, we also recycle as much of that material as we can as well. So we have like a concrete recycling, mattresses, scrap metal, which are larger, bulkier items, but and tires. We're also able to divert those items from the landfill to recycling facilities as well. And our tree waste and yard waste go to composting facilities. So hopefully that gives you some more information on the different types of recycling programs available to those who may not have a curbside program. Oh, thank you, Tyra. I see that we just added a link to the resident survey in the chat box, so you can check that out directly from here as well. Another question that we have come in, just a reminder, if you do want to speak and share your comments out loud, just type your first and last name and request to speak in the chat box, or if you just want to ask a question, you can also type that in there. I will just check in. Do we have anyone on the phone? It doesn't look like we have anyone just on the phone who's not in the Teams application, but if you are on the phone and not in the Teams application, you can unmute yourself briefly and let me know if you have a question or you want to speak. Okay, and here we have this other question. Okay, I see your request to speak. I'm going to address your question here first from James. You all spoke about the high cost of energy conversion of waste. Does this plan support groups that can provide energy conversion of waste on a more economic, sustainable scale with the support of the new House Bill 1953? I'm not familiar with that bill off the top of my head. Mike or Allison, do you guys know what that is?
I believe it was the bill that related to chemical recycling and encouraging that, and dealing with permitting issues for those types of facilities, such as a chemical recycling facility, and basically defining that more as a processing operation than a waste management operation.
Mm-hmm.
The plan does support those types of operations where the city can assist them and to work with those types of processors, whether it's from the front end side and looking at market development as an option. And we have had some discussions with people in the industry that are looking at those type of facilities. There seems to be a lot more activity in the last year or so along those lines, and it may hold out to have some real promise in terms of reducing the amount of waste that has to go to landfills.
Yeah, and we did include, as you mentioned, for the city to continue to monitor those technologies and facilities as they come online. I know the Houston Chronicle had a story, I think it was last week, on the new facility that Chevron is going to be opening, looking at plastics recycling. So there are some things happening even locally within the Houston area, and we we'll monitor those to see, how they work, and, if there's opportunities that are economically and environmentally practical to look at, for our waste streams as well. I did have so James Harris did request to speak, so I will call on him at this time. I know we have some other questions coming in and we'll come back to our questions, but I will call on James at this time. If you want to unmute yourself and just state your name and share your comments, you have 2 minutes. So.
Hello, group. My apologies. I noticed that Sarah saw my comments coming in on questions and, expressed to please speak. So I got the invite from another group person here, and I'm actually in the industry, starting in the industry as far as waste reduction. And so a lot of my comments are coming from more so a economical standpoint versus just a traditional, just a educational standpoint. So that's why they were pretty direct. But the concern is that the city has such a large footprint, and you all have such an infrastructure that is already consumed by the masses. I was thinking that if it was more of a corporate thing and started with the corporate going down, and then their education would possibly help the consumers to see that if they adjusted and they did better, then even, it's almost like start with your larger piece and then work down to the smaller, technically the public is much larger than corporate, but when you get the corporate brands involved, they have a much larger footprint to help educate their customers, the people that get to see them on a daily basis, and therefore expedite the growth pattern of helping people to understand how we can better assist our reduction, and not necessarily getting rid of it, but reducing what's going out there, repurposing it, restructuring it on a more sustainable closed circuit.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very timely comment. I don't know for those if you've noticed in the past, year or two, like marine debris or ocean plastic has become a significant concern for the public and also for the manufacturers and producers of the products and packaging that are made from plastic. And so we are seeing a lot of those corporate sustainability goals that Mike had mentioned. And even from a large scale, I think the industry group, the American Chemistry Council, has a goal for all plastic packaging to be recyclable, recoverable. I can't remember the end date, but in some short-term amount of time, they want to meet that goal. And so you are seeing a lot of that happen, which I think is correct, as we're residents, those that are recyclers, we're also consumers. So as we start to see those cues and start to see changes perhaps in the packaging of the products we use every day, and some people may actually make their purchasing decisions based on that as well. They may be looking for items that use less packaging or that can be composted or can be recycled. I think you will start to see that shift as that moves down the product chain from the manufacturer to the end consumer to ultimately the disposal options available. And I think there's some, as I mentioned, the EPA has put out their strategy for improving recycling as well. And part of that, I think, is improving the like the labeling and the information available about what products can be recycled and how to make that easier for individuals to understand whether they can put an item in their recycling cart or not, and make that more easily identifiable. So yeah, I don't know, Mike, did you want to add anything, or Allison, on this idea of helping to shift individual behavior from like a corporate sustainability level?
Oh, I think it's a great idea. And, in the plan, we look at, from an organizational standpoint, having more participation between the city and the private sector. One of the issues, though, is, for Houston's recycling program, Sarah's got a pretty slim staff and can only stretch so far. And if we had the additional resources to help bring in that private sector, I think it'd be a lot more effective. But it is where most of the waste is generated, and those companies are responsible for producing products that end up in the waste stream. So they need to be at the table.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add to that, Sarah, with what you mentioned from the American Chemistry Council, it's actually 2040 where they want 100% of plastic packaging reused, recycled, or recovered. And I think it's worth mentioning some of the other big corporations like Amazon, who is trying to look at their own packaging, and it gets into the extended producer responsibility. It's the phrase that's commonly used in the industry of those packaging manufacturers need to be more mindful of how toxic the material is and how much of the material there is in the packaging that they're making. And we're seeing more and more of those major corporations making some pretty big commitments, like Coke, like Amazon. And then you've got those trade organizations like the American Chemistry Council and the American Plastics Recyclers that are committed to being part of the solution as well, with plastics being such a major issue these days. So I think it's an excellent point to make that these producers need to change things, and they are looking for ways to do that. And each of us as individuals to incentivize those businesses to make those changes. So, if their customers are demanding those changes, we all get to be part of what I think James was alluding to, that circular economy. Mm-hmm. So I think it's definitely worthwhile to have that discussion. What that necessarily means directly in the city of Houston, I do feel like we've got some of potential strategies in the plan as far as working with the private sector. But I don't know that we've gotten exactly to the point that James was making with those tax breaks for companies that would have some kind of a commitment of zero waste to landfill or just reducing what they've got out there. But Sarah, I think you covered earlier there's potential issues for the city to be able to do that with those corporations.
Right. Yeah, this is all very interesting. I think we've covered a lot of ground in talking about the recycling part as well, which is something I'm very interested in. And it sounds like everybody in the meeting this evening is. we do have another question. I'm sorry. So this person, Hadari is originally, I guess, from San Diego, California. They say, being from San Diego, California, I've always known that you can take your recyclables such as cans, bottles, and phones and recycle them to obtain some money. Why doesn't Houston offer the same? And if they do, which I may not be aware of, why isn't it promoted? Great question. And I'll start, I guess, with talking about phones and electronics. So cell phones, yes. The city does not, like, I mean, we would not pay you for that, but many recyclers do. And there's many opportunities, I think, through like cell phone providers and through electronics recyclers. I think there's some organizations that you can mail it into them and receive like a gift card or some money. So I do think that for certain electronic items such as cell phones that are in good use, there is a value to be found. The other items like cans and bottles, I think, so California is a bottle bill state where they do have that deposit, container deposit for every container purchased, and then you can return those items and receive their deposit back. I think there's 11 states total that have those container deposit laws. Texas is not one of them, although it was proposed to the Texas state legislature for a couple of sessions recently, but it just didn't really gain any traction. But so, yeah, that's why we don't have those programs here. And again, I'll ask the project team if anybody wants to expound upon that.
This is Allison. I'll add to the bottle bill state, and I think you're exactly right, Sarah, with the 11 states that currently have those, and the states that have attempted to pass those in more recent years have been met with some opposition on the legislative side. And honestly, part of that is because local governments have invested money into those material recovery facilities like Houston. So when you spend money on a facility that would recycle things, a bottle bill potentially takes away some of that stream from those local government facilities, depending on how the system is set up. So it's interesting how and why there are sometimes oppositions to those bottle bills, but it is more of a challenge today to get those bottle bills passed in additional states.
Right, yeah. Oh, sorry, Mike, were you going to say something?
No, other than the fact that, for a number of materials, there are a number of scrap dealers throughout the city where they'll accept those materials for payment. They're not necessarily city facilities, but they are available to residents to basically sell their scrap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always been a strong market for scrap metal. I think that was one of the original recyclables before recycling as a concept was really thought of. And so that is still a very strong industry here. We do have a lot of individual scrap recyclers. And James, who spoke earlier, added in our comment log that, and I don't know, but he's suggesting that in California, to get your deposit back, the item you're submitting has to have a certain percentage of post-consumer material. So that's interesting. That's a good way to drive that demand for incorporating that post-consumer recycled material into the new materials made. So I think there's a pretty big demand right now for recycled plastic resin for certain grades of plastic, as some of these corporations are trying to meet those goals of recoverability and incorporating a certain level of post-consumer content into their new packages. So that is having an impact on the economy. So I will note this has been a very great discussion. We have just over 10 minutes left in our time this evening. We are scheduled to end at 7. So if you do have any questions or if you would like to request to speak, there's still that opportunity. So please do put your questions or your name, first, last name, and request to speak in the chat log, and we can call on you. I will ask, I know that Dr. Abati, I think, was on the call. And I think, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you've been a great member of our advisory task force, and we've appreciated all your input. And certainly, I know that I've spoken to your class a couple times over the years, and I think you helped get some of these TSU students here with us tonight for this discussion. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything. We have some time.
Thank you, Sarah, for the opportunity, and all the team members and the city of Houston. I really enjoyed, being there. I learned a lot, and I hope I contributed a little bit. And also, my students benefited from that involvement of mine. I was able to share with them, and I'm glad that they are present here today. And this report, the plan, is very important. And Sarah, you worked very hard, and all the team worked very hard. And it's coming to the public for comments also, and hope to see it on the ground, making a big difference in the services of the solid waste management. And I would like to thank Director Hayes also using this opportunity. And I don't have much to say. But I wish you all the best. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yes, thank you so much. That's wonderful. And hearing you speak has reminded me of some of the conversations we've had, and just from a general level of the importance of solid waste management planning. I mean, we're talking about the impact for Houston, but this is an activity and a thought process that's taken place, all over the world, and the circumstances and the variables in different countries and different cities. Some places have opportunities to learn from the way other countries have done it. Some are ahead of us. Some of the countries in the EU have a lot of that extended producer responsibility policy put into place for items like packaging and also hard to recycle items. And then, there's other countries that are still working to have sanitary landfills, and they have an opportunity too. But wherever you are, there is waste that's generated, and you do have to plan for it.
Sure.
So this is, this is one example. But if you're in Houston for school, this may not be your home. You may go back to some other part of the country where you live. But this is a program and a task that all cities have to face and plan for, because at the end of the day, appropriate handling of solid waste is a public health and safety issue. And so it's important that we think about that and do it in the way that is best protective of public health and the environment. That's our goal at the end of the day. Did anyone on the project team have anything else they wanted to add? I do have one more question that just came in as well. Does the plan have an offset plan for recyclable materials that were sent to landfills in 2019? I don't know, offset, if you're talking about like carbon offsets. I don't know exactly. I think that's something that's happening a lot in the actually in the organics world. I might call on Risa. I haven't called on her, maybe not so much for traditional recyclables, but I do think in the world of organics, they are looking at something called carbon farming, or something where you're putting the material back into the soil. Risa, maybe I know just a bit. Maybe you can expound on that.
Well, there's not a lot on that subject in the plan necessarily, although there is quite a bit in the plan addressing organics, since organics are, let's say, roughly half of the waste stream. Carbon farming is one aspect. Carbon trading is another aspect. Credits for diverting organics from the landfill. That's going forward. I'm a little confused when you ask about materials that were sent to the landfills in 2019. I have to admit, I'm not really following what your question is.
Well, so Yeah, Risa, this question was coming from James, who spoke earlier, so I will ask him to come back on the line, and he says he can explain what he's trying to ask a little better. So James, if you're there.
Yes, I am. I am here, and I was actually saying, do I ask this question? And I said, well, it's a tough one, and the reason why is because it isn't for the offsets, which I'm very familiar with the carbon credits and what have you. It's for the materials that, again, no one here on this call, I'm sure, is responsible for this, but the city consequently was sending stuff that was picked up in neighborhoods for recyclables, and they were sent to the landfills versus going to the recycling centers. And it was a couple of million pounds that were physically sent over there. And it was this thing that KHOU 11 did on their particular site, and our team actually dug into it a bit. And I reached out to the city to see if we could assist, to help offset that amount because it went to landfills. And that's not on this call. But how do we deal with stuff like that when the system that is so massive seems to somewhat be a little broken? Because it was basically just paperwork that was showing that, hey, we weren't sending it to the land, we were sending it to the landfills and not to the recycling centers. And it just got buried. I mean, tons and tons of material just got buried that should have been recycled. So stuff like that, how does the city combat that, moving forward?
Sure.
Checks and balances.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And this did actually, someone on one of our other meetings asked this question as well. And, we addressed it, and it's certainly not something we were happy about. It was dealt with. The city has corrective action policy things when they happen, and that was dealt with by our management team, and we've not had that issue going forward. So, that was a mistake that happened, and it was corrected, and moving forward, all of our recycling has been handled appropriately and taken to our recycling facility. So, I hope that would not be an issue in the future. So yeah, I'll ask Mike, Risa, Allison, any closing thoughts? We are winding down on time, or if anyone on the call has any other questions that you wanted to ask, please, let me know before we wrap up. We do appreciate you so much sharing your time with us this evening and hearing about our project. And we hope that if you've not already, you will take our survey and stay up to date on the project moving forward. Any closing thoughts from our project team before we wrap up for this evening?
I guess I just want to thank the students for participating in this, taking an interest in solid waste issues. Isn't a fairly important environmental issue that affects everybody, and also encourage them to, participate in the program. And if they've got recyclable materials, take them to the recycling center. And if you're doing that right now, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I would just, let I don't know if, what your studies are, if you're in sustainability, biology, environmental engineering, what it is you're looking at, but I'll materials management and resource recovery is a very vast industry. There's a lot of interesting things to get involved with. And so if this is something that you're interested in, I encourage you to pursue it, because there's a lot of different ways to get involved, and it's a lot more complex than you may think at first. And it really does touch our everyday lives. Everything, all of the waste that you generate is handled some way, somehow. And, that's what the city is with our partners and stakeholders in the community responsible for handling and planning for. So, okay, well, that I think is going to wrap up our evening here. Again, if you want, the recording from this meeting will be available on our project website. The slides are there already, as well as the documents. If you want to download and read those, find out more about the research that went into the plan and the recommendations. And if you have any questions or any other comments, please send us an email. You can email us at longrange@houstontx.gov. And we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a good night.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.